In the 1930s, a meal like this had to feed a whole family. A few potatoes, one onion, and whatever coins were left in the jar by the door. When nearly a quarter of the country was out of work, people learned to build a supper out of almost nothing. And the ones who got it right wrote it all down. This is the record of the cheap meals that carried them through, 16 of them, each one made to stretch a single dollar until it fed everyone at the table. Behind almost every one of these meals stood a soup kitchen, a sack of government flour and lard, or a small garden out back. People simply cooked with whatever they could get their hands on. Number 1, Hoover Stew. A pot of macaroni, canned tomatoes, and a few sliced hot dogs, thinned with water and stretched to feed as many mouths as showed up at the door. It took its name, bitterly, from the president people blamed for the hard times. In the shanty towns they called Hoovervilles. This was the bowl the soup kitchens handed out. A pound of pasta, a couple of cans, and a package of hot dogs could feed a family for days. It cost almost nothing, and it kept a lot of people alive. Number 2, the poor man's meal. Potatoes and onion fried together until they browned, with a single sliced hot dog thrown in at the end for a little bit of meat. The potatoes filled you up, and the hot dog gave it just enough protein to feel like a real dinner. Families kept making it for years after the hard times had passed. Number 3, creamed chipped beef. A little dried, salted beef softened in a simple flour and butter gravy and poured out over a couple slices of toast. The toast turned a scrap of meat into a filling meal, which is exactly why the army served it to soldiers in both world wars. They just gave it a much ruder name. Every soldier who came home knew it by heart, and plenty of them kept making it in their own kitchens for the rest of their lives. Cheap, hot, and filling was more than enough. Number 4, Dandelion Salad. The weed growing in every yard turned out to be free food, young dandelion greens dressed with a little vinegar and bacon fat. It cost nothing, and it put vitamins back into a plain diet of bread and potatoes. The Joy of Cooking, printed in 1931, told housewives exactly how to serve it. You had to pick the leaves young, before the summer turned them bitter. Pick them right, and a free handful off the lawn brought a fresh green to a table that almost never saw one. Number 5, Milkorno. A cheap gruel of cornmeal and dried powdered milk, cooked up into a hot breakfast that cost almost nothing to put on the table. This one wasn't a family recipe at all. Scientists at Cornell University designed it, on purpose, back in 1933, to feed hungry people for the least money possible. It never really caught on. A bowl of it was bland and gray, and people ate it only because they had to. But for a few of the hardest years, it quietly kept children fed. Number 6, Vinegar Pie. When lemons were a luxury that nobody could afford, a single spoonful of vinegar gave a pie the same bright, tangy bite for pennies. They called it the poor man's lemon pie. Just flour, sugar, water, and vinegar poured into a crust. The recipe was already sitting in cookbooks back in 1913. It sounds strange today, but baked slow and sweet in a hot oven. Nobody at the table tasted the vinegar at all. Only a bright, custardy pie that cost next to nothing to make. Number 7, Mock Apple Pie. A pie that looked like apple, smelled like apple, and tasted like apple, with no apples anywhere inside it. The filling was nothing but plain crackers, soaked in a sugar syrup with cinnamon and a squeeze of lemon. Cut warm, most people at the table never guessed the difference. The trick was already old even then. Cooks had been faking apple pie with soda crackers since long before the hard times ever hit. Desperation simply made it famous. Number 8, Peanut Butter Bread. A loaf that needed no eggs, no yeast, and no butter at all. Just flour, a little sugar, and a big scoop of peanut butter. Peanut butter was cheap, and it packed in the fat and the protein that a poor kitchen was missing. A single loaf could carry a family through breakfast the whole week. Spread with a little more peanut butter, a single slice of it was a breakfast a child could carry to school in one hand. Cheap, filling, and it kept for days on the shelf. Number 9, Cornbread and Milk. A wedge of cornbread crumbled into a bowl, cold milk poured over the top, and that was the whole supper. It was breakfast when there was nothing else in the house, and dinner when the day had been long. 2 cheap things in a bowl that somehow always felt like enough. For a lot of country families, this was simply what you ate. Sweet cornbread and cold milk, morning or night, week after week, until the better times finally came back around. Number 10. Spaghetti with carrots and white sauce. Soft boiled noodles and boiled carrots, bound together in a plain sauce made of flour and milk. There was no meat in it, and by most accounts it was not very good. But it came recommended straight from the White House, from the First Lady, Eleanor Roosevelt herself. Pasta was cheap and it filled a plate, so nobody minded very much that it was bland. When the money was short, filling on the table always beat fancy on the table. Number 11. Prune pudding. Dried prunes, boiled soft with a little sugar and thickened with cornstarch, served up as a plain but genuinely sweet dessert. President Roosevelt ate it himself as part of a White House lunch that cost about 7.5 cents, on purpose to stand with the people who were going hungry. It became a quiet symbol of the times. If a plain dessert of boiled prunes was good enough for the president's own table, then no family anywhere needed to feel ashamed to serve it. Number 12. Boxed macaroni and cheese. A dry box with a packet of powdered cheese, sold for a few cents, that stood in for a whole meal of real cheese and cream. It was launched right in the middle of the hard times, built to be frugal from the start. Nearly a century later, that same little box has never once left the shelf. A single box could feed 4 people for pennies, and it never spoiled on the shelf. That is exactly why it outlasted the hard times, 2 world wars and every hard year since. And then, just as families were finding their footing, the world went to war. Rationing arrived, and suddenly even these cheap meals could feel like a feast. Sugar was the very first thing rationed, and the last to ever come back, cut down to just a few ounces a person each week. Meat, butter, and cheese were all counted out in little paper points. Number 13. Variety meats. With good beef rationed down to a few points a week, families were pushed toward the cheap cuts nobody used to want: liver, heart, and kidney. The government even gave them a friendlier name. They printed posters calling them variety meats, hoping a nicer word would help the cheapest cuts go down a little easier. Number 14. Woolton Pie. A pie with no meat in it at all, just root vegetables and gravy, tucked under a crust of pastry or mashed potato. It was named after the man in charge of feeding wartime Britain, the Minister of Food, Lord Woolton. When meat was nearly impossible to get, this is what dinner looked like. Britain ate a great deal of Woolton Pie, and almost nobody actually liked the stuff. But it was filling, it was cheap, and for years on end, it was very often simply what there was. Number 15. Bubble and Squeak. Last night's leftover potatoes and cabbage, pressed together into a pan and fried until the whole thing was crisp and brown. It got its strange name from the sound it made hissing in the hot pan. Nothing was ever thrown out. Last night's dinner simply turned into this morning's breakfast. It turned yesterday's cold scraps into a hot, crisp breakfast, and it never really went away. Families across Britain still cook it today, straight from the leftovers in the pan. Number 16. Spam. A tin of cooked, salted pork that never spoiled and never needed a fridge, shipped by the millions to feed soldiers and families through the war. It was cheap, it was everywhere, and it could be fried, boiled, or eaten cold straight out of the tin. The soldiers grew sick of the sight of it, but it never once let them go hungry. It fed whole armies straight through the war, and then it simply stayed. That same humble blue tin is very likely sitting somewhere in your cupboard right now. None of these meals were fancy, but every single one did the job it was built to do: turn almost nothing into supper and carry a family through to the next day. The old cooks solved hunger with a potato, a little salt, and a whole lot of nerve. It isn't a trick, and it isn't nostalgia. It's the record, and it still works. That's one more page from the Almanac. Subscribe. There's a lot that we forgot, and one by one I'm writing it all back down.